Hey, 7th graders, before I start to read, I wanted to talk about spelling. If you noticed on the agenda page, I have some different, posters, signs about spelling. Spelling matters. When you are doing your ed puzzles, you have your book in front of you. You may go back to your book to look for the answer, and I encourage you to. If you don't know the answer or you're not confident in your answer, look back in the book. But also, you can look back in the book and spell things correctly. So like yesterday, the question, what did Sam come back home for? If you put brown bass, that's incorrect. He did not come back home for fish. He came back home for brown bass. So, spelling matters. Okay, we're going to get started. I'm going to start at the bottom of page 18. So, last two lines. And this is where Sam and Tim are in the barn. Sam has just told Tim he wanted to come for brown bass. And Tim had swore that he won't tell anybody. I wish I hadn't. I was afraid to go back on my oath. But I was just as afraid, or I was just as scared of Sam stealing the brown bass too. Let's finish up with the stock and go to bed. I figured if we went to bed, he'd fall right asleep because he'd walked 30 miles up from New Haven that day. In the morning, we'd all have to go to church. It was a law to go to church on Sunday, and it'd be hard for him to steal the gun with people milling around and coming over to the tavern the way they did after church. I finished milking old Prue. Sam took the eggs up to the house and came back, and we fed the stock and watered them. We didn't say much. I knew that Sam was sorry, he told me, and I was thinking of ways to stop him from doing it. Finally, we were through. Let's go to bed, I said. All right, he said. Going up. I'll be up in a minute. I want to talk to Father. Please come right up, though. Don't worry, Tim. Just going up to bed. I didn't want to leave him, but I knew there wasn't any use in arguing. So I said goodnight to Father and Mother, said some prayers, and went upstairs. There are 4 bedrooms on the 2nd floor of our house, where lodgers stay when we have them. We get a lot of people traveling through between Stratford and Danbury and Litchfield and Norwalk, or even going over to New York, and they need places along the way to sleep. Above the 2nd floor is a loft where Sam and I sleep. There isn't much in it, just a couple of beds. There are no stairs up to the loft, just a ladder. I climbed up, not bothering to take a light. I knew where everything was. Besides, there are cracks in the floor which let little pieces of light through, so you can see a little if you have to. I undressed, got into bed, and pulled the blankets over me. I was always pretty tired by the time I went to bed with all the chores I had around the tavern every day. But I wanted to stay awake to wait for Sam, so he could tell me some stories about telling points. To keep from falling asleep, I lay on my back staring up at the black and watching the dots shift around in front of my eyes. But my eyes kept closing. So I began reciting all the books of the Bible from first to last, and I got to somewhere around Obadiah before I fell asleep. When I woke up, somebody was shouting. I sat up in bed. It was Father. I couldn't hear the words, but I could hear the sound. His heavy, hard voice going on and on. Then there was Sam's voice, and he was shouting too. Then Father again. I got out of bed, climbed quietly down the ladder, and crouched by the top of the stairs. You are not having the gun, Father shouted. You are not going to Wethersfield, and you are going to take off that uniform right now if you have to go to church tomorrow naked. Father, I will not have subversion. I will not have treason in my house. We are Englishmen. We are subjects of the king. This rebellion is the talk of madmen. Father, I am not an Englishman. I'm an American, and I'm going to fight to keep my country free. Oh, God, Sam, fight? Is it worth war to save a few pence in taxes? It's not the money, it's the principle. Principle, Sam? You may know principle, Sam, but I know war. Have you ever seen a dear friend lying in the grass with the top of his skull off and his brains sliding out of him like wet oats? Have you ever looked into the eyes of a man with his throat cut and the blood pouring out between his fingers, knowing that there was nothing he could do? In 5 minutes he would be dead, yet still trying to beg for grace and not being able because his windpipe was cut in two. Have you ever heard a man shriek when he felt a bayonet go through the middle of his back? I have, Sam, I have. I was at Louisburg the year before you were born. Oh, it was a great victory. They celebrated it with bonfires all over the colonies. And I carried my best friend's body back to his mother, sewed up in a sack. Do you want to come home that way? Do you think I want to hear a wagon draw up one summer's morning and go out to find you stiff and bloody and your eyes staring blank at the sky? Sam, it isn't worth it. Now take off that uniform and go back to your studies. I won't, Father. They were silent. It was terrible. My heart was pounding and I could hardly breathe. Sam, I am ordering you. You can't order me anymore, Father. I'm a man. A man? You're a boy, Sam. A boy dressed up in a gaudy soldier suit. Ooh, he sounded bitter. Father! Go, Sam, go. Get out of my sight. I can't bear to look at you anymore in that vile costume. Get out! And don't come back until you come dressed as my son, not as a stranger. Father! Go, Sam. There were sounds. I could hear Father breathing as if he had climbed a mountain. Then the door slammed. I was afraid Father would come up, so I slipped away from the top of the stairs and began to climb the ladder up to the loft. But then I heard some more sounds, some funny ones, sounds I'd never heard before. They puzzled me. I slipped back to the stairs and softly began to ease myself down them a step at a time. About 5 steps down, I could see into the tap room. Father had his head down on the table, and he was crying. I'd never seen him cry before my whole life. And I knew there were bad times coming. Okay, chapter 2. My father's name, and I'm going to say it, my father's name was Eliphalet, but everyone called him Life. My mother's name was Susanna. That one's easier than Eliphalet, or however you pronounce Dad's name. Father was born in Reading, where we have our tavern, but Mother was born over in New York. He had cousins over there, where she used to live. Their names were Platt, which used to be Mother's name. I'd never met them, but when Father went over to Verplank's Point every year to sell cattle and buy supplies, he stayed with them and caught up on the news. Reading wasn't much of a town compared with places like New Haven. Although actually, I'd never been to New Haven. But the only big place I'd ever been was Fairfield, down on Long Island Sound, where I used to go sometimes with Father and Sam to pick up sugar or rum that came up from the Barbados in big ships. There were thousands of people in Fairfield. At least it seemed like that. There were only a few hundred in Reading. Reading was divided into 2 parts, Reading Center and Reading Ridge, which is where we lived. Our tavern was at a corner where the Dansbury-Fairfield Road met Cross Highway. Across the Danbury-Fairfield Road from us was the church and the graveyard. Next to the church, on the other side of Cross Highway, was an empty field where the train band practiced drilling. Next door to us was the Betts house, and scattered around were a dozen more houses, the Sanford's house, and the Rogers house, and Mr. Heron's house, and some others. Our tavern was finished with shingles, but some of the richer people, like Mr. Heron, had white clapboard siding on their houses. Our church in Reading Ridge was the Anglican church. Anglican meant English church. In England, everybody had to belong to it. Or at least they were supposed to. In Connecticut, we had freedom of religion, so you could belong to any church you wanted, unless you were a Baptist. But there was hardly any of them in Connecticut. Over at Reading Center, there was a Presbyterian church. Naturally, if you were a Presbyterian, you built your house over there. And if you were an Anglican, you built here on the ridge. Although, of course, there were lots of farmers all around who didn't live near either church, and just went to the one they wanted. Because our church was the English church, The people here on the ridge seemed to be more on the Tory side and wanted to be loyal to the king. To tell the truth, I didn't exactly understand what the argument was all about. Ever since I could remember, all my life in fact, there had been these discussions and arguments and debates about whether we ought to obey His Majesty's government or whether we should rebel. What kept confusing me about it was that the argument didn't have two sides the way an argument should, but about 6 sides. Some people said that the king was the king, and that was that, and we ought to do what he said. Other people said that men were supposed to be free to govern themselves, and we should rebel and drive the lobsterbacks out altogether. Some others said, well, they were born Englishmen, and they wanted to die Englishmen, but that the colonies ought to have more say in their government, and that maybe we'd have to give the lobsterbacks a taste of blood just to show the king that we meant business. Oh, people had all kinds of ideas, that we New Englanders ought to join together, or that all the colonies ought to set up one big government, or that, well, I don't know. I can't even remember all the different sides there were to the argument. You can see how confusing it was when you realize that sometimes Sam's side was called patriots, and sometimes they were called rebels. I guess I'd been reading newspaper stories about it, and hearing people shout over the whole thing for so long, that I didn't listen anymore. It just went in one ear, not the other. But now it seems like it wasn't going to be just arguments anymore. Around 50 of the Minutemen and lots of British troops had been killed on Friday at Lexington or Concord, or wherever it was, although nobody seemed to know how many for sure. And Sam was going to fight. Sunday morning was bright and sunny and warm. The rain had stopped during the night. Although the road was full of mud, the fields were drying and the birds were singing. I couldn't enjoy it very much, though. The fight Sam had had with Father the night before still hung around me the way a bad dream does sometimes. Sam and Father had had fights before, and they always got over them in a day or two. But this one seemed worse than the others, and it worried me that maybe they wouldn't fix it up. I didn't think Father would want to talk about it. Usually when something important happened, he would just ignore it until he decided what to do. So I was surprised that he brought it up when we were getting ready to go to church. Tim, did Sam say anything to you about going to war? I didn't want to lie to Father, but I didn't want to give Sam away either. Well, he said he was, but I thought he was probably just boasting. He wasn't boasting, Sam. Sorry, he wasn't boasting, Tim. He's going over to Wethersfield. Fools are planning to march up to Massachusetts to meddle in something that isn't their affair. Is he really going to fight, Father? I hope not, he said. Then he frowned. What do you think of all of this, Tim? I don't know, Father, I said. I can't figure out exactly what it's about. I suppose Sam's been preaching rebellion to you. I tried to think of something that wouldn't get Sam in any more trouble. He said we ought to be free. That's just college boy wind, Father said. He sounded pretty scornful. Who isn't free? Aren't we free? The whole argument is over a few taxes that hardly amount to anything for most people. What's the use of principles if you have to be dead to keep them? We're Englishmen, Timmy. Of course there are injustices. There are always injustices. It's a way of God's world. But you never get rid of injustices by fighting. Look at Europe. They've had one war after another for hundreds of years, and show me where anything ever got any better for them. Let's go to church. It's a time for prayer. I decided to forget about the whole thing. It was too worrying. We went out across the muddy road to church, and I climbed up into the balcony where the children, Indians, and black people sat. Redding Ridge being a small place, I knew everybody there. All the kids, and Tom Morups, and Ned, the Star's black man. I sat down next to Jerry Sanford. Jerry was a couple of years younger than me, but he was the person closest to my age around, and we did a lot of things together. The first thing he said was, we heard Sam ran away to fight. Nobody was going to let me forget about it, that was sure. Mr. Beach made it the subject of a sermon. He really got wound up on it, too. He said that our first duty was to God, but that our Lord Jesus Christ had said, Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's. And that meant we were supposed to be loyal Englishmen.